So it's my pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Sophie Loidolt, here to the Center for the History of Women Philosophers and Scientists in Paderborn. It's our great pleasure to have you here speaking about Hannah Arendt. So I have a few questions about her as a philosopher and about you and your work on her. So I hope you'll indulge me by answering some of these questions. So Arendt is known by many primarily as a political theorist, I think largely due to her work on the origin of totalitarianism and her work on violence, and as we spoke a little bit before, because she herself sort of eschewed this label of being called a philosopher. So my question is, why should we take Arendt seriously as a philosopher and as a phenomenological philosopher in particular?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there is this famous statement of hers that she's not a philosopher. But I think the first thing that has to be taken in account is that she says that for several reasons. Theoretical, philosophical reasons, personal reasons, political reasons. And I think, well, for my approach, the philosophical reason was one of the most important, that she always says, well, look, philosophy always deals with man in the singular, as she says, with the essence of the human being in the singular. Mostly she has the Platonic Aristotelian tradition in mind, but also later. And I mean, even Heidegger speaks about first Dasein. Mitsein is, of course, a constitutive of Dasein, but we're talking about Dasein, and we're not starting with the plural. And Hannah Arendt thinks herself that, you know, this constitutes in a way philosophy for her, thought. And she says that what she's doing is really thinking the existence of human beings in the plural as a condition for many things. Mm-hmm. And that is what she coins as the political and political theory. And I would say that is a very philosophical reason for distancing oneself from philosophy. There are, of course, other reasons too, academic reasons, personal reasons, political reasons. She was included from academia, being Jewish. As a woman, she didn't have an easy position either. And with her experience of 1933, she experienced that mostly philosophers, academics, were very much in the mode of Gleichschaltung more than other people. But to come back to the philosophical point, why should we take her serious as a philosopher? I think exactly because we can also say, well, it is a philosophical point to try to think human existence in the plural. And that's exactly what she has done. And so in this way, we can say, this is a new way of doing philosophy. And why should we take her seriously as a phenomenologist? I think because she has worked out exactly that question with phenomenological means and phenomenological terms and phenomenological deep structure in her thought. That's what I want to argue for. That might not be that obvious for English speakers because that might be only a philological point, but it's quite interesting. Her most important philosophical work, as one could argue, The Human Condition, has been written twice. First in English, and then 2 years later again in German. And what do you do as a native speaker if you have written first a book in a language that is not your language? You don't translate it one by one, but you have the book there and then you write the book again. And so in the German version, and this is what I discovered sort of as being an initially a German speaker, a reader of her German works, I saw all these phenomenological connections. I saw this thing going on. And when I decided to write the book in English, I went to the English text, and none of the passages I found so, like really clearly phenomenological were there in the English version. Mm. So it might be also that issue that in the English-speaking world, well, the reception, I think, has of a very high quality, yeah? That the phenomenological influence was not that visible from the very beginning. That's why I want to argue that there is this sort of deep structure in her thought that is not immediately visible, but that operates. I mean, just to use a distinction that Eugen Fink has made between operative and thematic concepts. I think some concepts in Arendt are clearly phenomenological that are thematic. Appearance, world, I mean the whole world notion, you can't get it without a phenomenological background. Experience. But I would also say that there are a lot of notions that are operative, like intentionality, subjectivity, intersubjectivity, things like that, that are really important for her core phenomenon she wants to articulate, which I would like to call an actualization of plurality in a space of appearances. And I think you could articulate that as one of the very important theories in phenomenology, not only about intersubjective relations, but also about the mind-world relation, that we are of the world fundamentally, that we are in the home of appearances, and that being a self is appearing before and with others. So, and that's why I think we should take her seriously as a phenomenologist, even if it's not obvious at first point, and maybe also not in the dominant reception at the moment. But my claim would be that we can't really understand what she's doing and how she's trying to reformulate the political as a phenomenology of plurality if we don't go back to the phenomenological tradition.
So what then do you make of, there's a traditional distinction, I think, between her more political writings, like the ones I've just mentioned, and her phenomenological writings proper, so The Human Condition that you spoke about, and then her last great work, The Life of the Mind. Do you think that this is an artificial distinction between these different sets of works, or is there a commonality between them?
Well, I mean, to be sure, she focused on very concrete political problems in some of her writings as well, just to mention the Eichmann case, or I don't know, but and the totalitarianism book is, of course, very concrete in historical analysis as well. But I do think that the distinction can only work as a distinction where we can see how these two things work together. As I've said before, I think that Arendt's great philosophical aim is to develop a theory of plurality and of human existence in the plural, which is what she calls the political. I mean, the political is not politics as we understand it normally, but is sort of an existential basic form. And it's not the Carl Schmitt version, where you have the friend-enemy distinction, which you could call a dissociative theory of the political. But she tries to do something else and says, look, I mean, existing in the plural means that we're distinct and unique, but we can only articulate this uniqueness and only be unique and only be a who if we are in a community, and that doesn't mean a harmonious community, but that's mainly the essence of the political is debate, and is sort of articulating your opinion not in harmony but also in conflict with others. And I think that she developed this theory in what you would call her more philosophical writings or phenomenological writings, up to The Life of the Mind, where she really goes saying being is appearance. And this is not just a theory that only counts, for a special space, but that is a general theory, a phenomenological theory about what being is. And I think that is deeply connected in how she understands concrete political phenomena. So I wouldn't want to make that difference to, like saying she's worked in this field and has worked in that field and God knows how they go together. No, but she has analyzed concrete phenomena, and she has developed a theory, also a theory of judgment, and about thinking, how she deals with these phenomena and what these phenomena are about, that this has to be read together, I think.
So now I kind of want to ask the one of the more stock questions I think everyone who studies Arendt gets asked. In philosophy, we have this tendency to define people in terms of different philosophical traditions. So someone is a Platonist, someone is an Aristotelian. And because, as you've already mentioned, Arendt engages in some of these etymological discussions sometimes, or philological considerations when she's developing concepts. And because of her interest, in terms of work and labor and activity, there's a tendency to always look at her in connection with Heidegger, who is clearly an influence on her. But in what way should we distance ourselves from this Heideggerian sort of reading of Arendt? Or maybe a better way to put it is, how do we see Hannah Arendt as an original thinker and not just lump her in with some sort of a school of Heideggerian phenomenology?
Yeah, I think a lot of things have to be said about that. I mean, first of all, I think it's quite clear that no one should put Hannah Arendt in any kind of box, because that's simply not possible. I mean, there were not only a lot of other philosophical, very important influences like Kant and Aristotle, just to name two, but also, and that has been worked out in the reception in the last 20 years quite well, I think her direct entanglement, say, with Zionist politics, totalitarianism, and the analysis of it, concrete political things and influences that are not possible. It's simply not possible to trace everything back to phenomenology. And if I say I want to read her as a phenomenologist, my claim is really only to say, look, there's this structure, the way how she thinks about issues and problems is a phenomenological way, for example, in the way how she reads Kant, I mean, how she wants to transfer his notion of spontaneity into the world of appearances by calling it natality and by giving it an existential taste, let's say. But okay, now there we're at Heidegger, and Heidegger is, of course, I mean, there has a lot of things have been written about that. We have known since the 90s also about the romantic relationship that has, again, provoked a lot of literature of very different quality. And it's interesting that, or it's sad actually, that whenever we speak about a female philosopher, we have sort of an obsessive compulsive neurosis to directly speak about the male philosopher. It's not only Arendt, it's Simone de Beauvoir, where we immediately speak about Sartre, and even if we don't find a love affair, we say Stein was this assistant of Husserl, and what is the assistant relationship?
Or she was in love with Ingarden or with Hans
All right,
Lips or
yeah, exactly. So I mean, nobody's denying that there is important influence of Heidegger, but Heidegger has been influential for so many people in the 20th century, where we then, I mean, Gadamer, Löwitz, Levinas, Merleau-Ponty, just to name a few, Sartre, where we don't talk about Heidegger then all the time. So I think to appreciate what she has actually done with Heidegger's theories is to appreciate how she has transformed them. And I would say that there have been good publications about that as well, named Sheila Ben Habib's book on Arendt, or Dana Wille has written a good book on Arendt and Heidegger, The Fate of the Political, and that has been worked through. But what do we do now? I don't think that we shouldn't always talk about Heidegger, especially if we want to find out what is the phenomenological heritage Arendt is working on. And that's why I prefer to see her not as student or lover or follower of just Heidegger, but I prefer, and I think, I mean, I would argue that this is the plausible view, that she much more belongs to this generation I would call second generation phenomenologists, whereas the first generation would be Husserl, Heidegger, Scheele, and the second generation, all born around 1905, more or less, would be people like Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Levinas, Patočka, Arendt as well. And these are all people who worked creatively with the heritage of Husserl as well as Heidegger, and partly also Scheele, and who had a big transformative influence. Take Levinas, and I like to make an analogy here, how Levinas has transformed phenomenology to a sort of ethical approach by focusing on the paradigm of alterity and the face-to-face experience. I would say a direct analogy is Arendt having transformed phenomenology into a possibly genuinely political approach by focusing on the core phenomenon of plurality and paradigm of plurality. So that's how I like to see her, and I think that opens up much more connections and interesting connections to the phenomenological tradition, even if she, I mean, it doesn't matter if she was in concrete discussion with those people or not. Sometimes she was, sometimes she wasn't. But what I'm more interested in are the systematical points. And I think it's much more interesting to see her in that kind of what I call second generation phenomenology than in only, this being a student of thing. Yeah.
Well, those systematic points, I think, then dovetail nicely into my final question for you, and that is, could you explain to us the main thesis of your most recent book on the phenomenology of plurality, which is a work on Hannah Arendt, or using the philosophy of Hannah Arendt, and what brought you to writing that work?
Well, I'd say that I try to develop phenomenology of plurality by departing from Arendt, and there are basically two theses here that lead my way through the book. The first is, as I said before, that I want to systematically work out this deep structure of phenomenological thought that is going on there. So what I try to work out is, how does the notion of appearance, of experience, of intentionality, of world figure in her work? While considering that there is this little text on was ist Existenz, what is existence philosophy, where she tries to sort of position herself in that whole tradition, and where a big question figures, and that is, what is reality? And that is a big question, of course, in the phenomenological debate, and you can make a difference between sort of the more Cartesians here and those who try to be anti-Cartesian, whatever. Yeah. And I see her in this tradition, and then try to work out how does she apply phenomenological concepts. And the second thesis would be, how does she, by departing from this core phenomenon, being a self is being with others, being in the world is always already being in the world together with others and appearing before others. I would say that is sort of the core phenomenon she departs from. And the second thesis is that departing from this phenomenon transforms core phenomenological notions like intentionality, subjectivity, intersubjectivity, appearance. You have a fundamental pluralization and politicization of these terms in her work. So ontology and phenomenology is not a neutral enterprise anymore, but gets politicized in its very deep structures. And that is sort of the approach I first try to introduce methodically. And then I try to develop this very core phenomenon as a theory of political intersubjectivity, if you like. And in the end, I also try to argue that in itself, this harbors a sort of intrinsic ethics. So Arendt herself wanted to have that separated and had other ethical considerations, but I think within this phenomenon itself, there are some important ethical points, also including alterity and things like that I try to work out in the last chapter. And I try to engage, what I also try to do is I try to engage a lot with the other two strands you have in the philosophical reception of Arendt, namely the more Habermasian school, which Sheila Ben Habib more or less represents, and then the more postmodern readings. And I want to establish a third way of this phenomenological reading, because I think Sheila Ben Habib's book is a great book, but whatever she can't assimilate into the Habermasian approach, she calls the phenomenological essentialism of Hannah Arendt. And I try to really argue against this sort of labeling, because I think it's not true. There is no essentialism in the classical way going on, that can be read much more productively. And on the other hand, I want to say that, the postmodern reading that emphasizes performativity and everything, I'm fine with that. But I still also think that Arendt has a theory, that there is a theory of subjectivity and intersubjectivity that doesn't only talk about structures, but that really talks about experiences. And I want to bring that in again. And as for the motivations, I read Arendt quite early, but I come from a Husserlian corner, you would say. So I've worked a lot on Husserl, and I always had this sort of, I found reading Arendt on the one hand very challenging and refreshing, and she had this political thing, and I think phenomenology does have its deficits with dealing with issues of the political. And there were these writings, but on the other hand, I could see that Arendt was not really, taken in the phenomenological community. And on the other hand, the people who would work on Arendt would very often not, be able to say what phenomenology is actually about, or would only link it to Heidegger. So my motivation was actually to get this together and to introduce Arendt to phenomenologists as being really an interesting figure working phenomenologically, even if not that systematically, as many say. But I think that doesn't matter. You just have to see what's going on there. And on the other hand, to make clear to people who like to read Arendt and to try to explain what is really that background that figures in her thought as I see it. So that was, and then this other thing about the German and English text, and I really found it interesting, and these were those motivations I had to write the book.
Well, great. So I just have one final bonus question.
Okay.
How does one get a desk copy of your book? No,
just ask
Thanks so
me.
much.
I'll
Thanks so
send it
much,
to you.
Sophie. Yeah, that's great.